As we close in on Election Day, one thing is clear despite all the unknowns. Donald Trump is entering this race in a stronger polling position than he had in either of his previous campaigns. Back in 2016 and 2020, he was the underdog right down to the wire. But now, depending on who you ask or which forecast you follow, he's in a virtual toss up, if not a slight edge. Today, we're diving deep into the Electoral College map, looking at the latest high quality polling for every competitive race. Some states are already considered safe territory for either Trump or Biden, likely with little surprise in store. But the spotlight is on the 7 battleground states we're about to explore where the fiercest clashes are underway, and each vote could make all the difference. The states already labeled as safe or likely for either candidate almost certainly mark a foregone result, starting with the 7 p.m. Eastern closures in Virginia and Georgia. We will move in sequence of poll closing times. First, the most recent poll from Roanoke College indicates Harris leading Trump by 10 points at 51% of 41% in Virginia, of 851 registered voters pulled from October 25th to 29th. This margin reflects the 2020 outcome whereby Joe Biden won Virginia by just over 10 points. The first time in 80 years the state supported a Democrat by double digits. Given this 10-point lead for Harris, Virginia on our map falls into the safe blue category. Treating Virginia as a state they never really felt they could flip, the Trump campaign has mostly neglected this state. Now talk about Georgia, next with 16 electoral votes with Biden's margin barely slinking out at just 0.2 of a percentage point. It was the closest race in 2020 turning blue for the first time since 1992. Record black voting, particularly in and around Atlanta, drove that result. But compared to 4 years ago, polling data reveals Trump up more than 20 points among black voters here in 2024 for Democrats who rely on high black voter turnout and strong margins to remain competitive in Georgia. Even if just half of those gains materialize, could be a major setback. Early voter statistics showing declining turnout among black voters, while the electorate leans wider and older, complicates matters even more for the Harris campaign. Both signals point to Republicans based on a survey of more than 1,000 likely voters from October 17th to 25th. The Citadel's most recent poll shows Trump with a 2-point lead at 49% to Harris's 47%. We will thus map Georgia in the tilt Republican category. Trump and Harris thus split the first 2 states here, raising Harris's electoral vote count to 212 over Trump's 148. Recall that 270 is the cutoff point to land the presidency now at 7:30 p.m. The next wave of poll closing strikes, we now focus on Ohio and North Carolina. Beginning in Ohio, sometimes referred to as the ultimate bellwether in past decades, though Trump lost the Electoral College, Ohio supported him by 8 points in 2020, so ending the adage that as goes Ohio, so goes the country. According to the most recent poll by YouGov CE Bowling Green University, which included exactly 1,000 likely voters in mid-October, Trump 50% to 43%. Looking at the overall average, that poll is not the first one implying the former president might underperform his 2020 margin. Here, based on 17 total polls taken starting late July, he leads by less than 6 points. Ohio falls in the lean Republican with a margin of 2 to 7 points. At last, let's consider North Carolina, which holds 16 electoral votes following 1 census increment. The most recent poll in the USA, carried out between October 23rd and 26th, reveals Trump and Harris in an exact tie here at 47%. Each among 853 likely voters, we will thus directly put North Carolina straight into the tie column. Here still, this would not be the first time Democrats were teased here only to fail, though generally competitive Democrats have not won a federal election here since 2008. Republicans have won the last 8 presidential and Senate contests all by less than 6-point margins, though leading in the final poll average arriving on election night. Trump carried North Carolina in 2020 by just over a point, and thus Trump remains a clear favorite based on the prediction market odds here from BET Online, even while it is noted as a tie on the map with a minus 275 score. The Republican has a roughly 70 to 75% chance of winning. Unfortunately, Trump's electoral vote count is raised to 165. With these estimates still, Harris leads at 212, though the most battlefields close an hour later at 9 p.m. Our next poll closing is at 8 p.m., the biggest of the night in terms of volume, starting in New Hampshire, which usually stands as the only competitive state in the otherwise Democrat-dominated New England. Let us get going. Voting for Joe Biden by 7 points in 2020 marks a dramatic leftward turn from the 2016 cycle when Trump came within half a point of turning the race against Hillary Clinton with almost 3,000. Likely voters contacted on October 28th and 29th, the last St. Anselm College poll shows Harris is on track to hold New Hampshire by a narrower but still comfortable margin of 5 points. Harris marks 51% over Trump's 46%. New Hampshire goes down as lean blue here as a result. Florida and Pennsylvania still show at 8 p.m., but they also symbolize change. Originally, the classic swing state Florida has shifted firmly rightward. One of only 5 states where Trump finally widened his margin from 2016. Both campaigns lavished unheard of amounts of money into Florida. In 2020, in 8 consecutive elections, Florida had seen results decided by less than 6 points, though. In 2024, that streak is probably ending with Trump leading by 9 points in the latest Florida Atlantic University poll, which places him at 50.3% to Harris's 45%. The longest streak of this kind in the nation. This outcome is not aberrant based on the cycle's polling average. Trump leads by 6.5 points over 30 polls on our map. Florida will be noted in the likely Republican column. Now, when I mentioned a changing of the guard, I was referring to Pennsylvania, which will eventually be the battlefield of 2024. Here, more campaign funds than in any other state have been allocated. Pennsylvania is the biggest of the true toss-up states with 19 electoral votes. Nate Silver's latest estimate places its chances of tipping the vote at 35%. Winning Pennsylvania would drive Harris and Trump almost to a 90% probability of obtaining 270 electoral votes, based on 500 likely voters polled between October 27th and 30th. The most recent Suffolk University poll appropriately displays a dead tie between Trump and Harris, each at 49%, with almost equal polling average. Pennsylvania reflects a race that has stayed within the margin of error for both candidates. Trump had a small lead for roughly 1 week, but Harris led earlier in the campaign consistently. Pennsylvania will be placed in the tie column next to North Carolina, and like the Tar Heel state, we find Trump preferred in Pennsylvania based on prediction. Markets may be it with smaller odds at minus 140. All right, now that the 8 o'clock hour at last comes to an end. Trump keeps closing the distance to 270. Our 6 states carry combined electoral votes worth 92, except Nevada will shut its doors at 9 p.m. For this reason, I designate this battlefield as Central Time. The hour between 9 and 10 could make or break the 270 electoral vote race. Early returns from Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania already help us to have a decent sense of who's favored by now. With the first vote declines from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona, I believe we will most likely have an 80–90% chance as to who will finally come out on top. Starting in the Midwest with Michigan and Wisconsin, two of the three important WIMP states adjacent to Pennsylvania. Over the past three presidential contests, these states have been absolutely decisive. All three went barely for Trump in 2016, which gave him the votes required to reach 274 years later. They turned to Biden, driving him past the cutoff. Historically, Wisconsin has been more competitive for Republicans, while Michigan has tended more blue, while Wisconsin was far tighter with a 0.6% margin. Biden won Michigan by 2.8%. Pennsylvania came in middle, giving Biden a 1.2% victory. Trump hardly claimed Michigan in 2016, 0.2%, with somewhat wider but still razor-thin margins in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Once more in 2024, the most effective route to the White House passes via the WIMP states for the Democrats. For Harris, Michigan is absolutely required. One cannot practically see a situation whereby she wins the presidency without carrying the 15 electoral votes with just 1% undecided or supporting other candidates. Marist College's most recent poll shows leading Trump by 3 points, 51% to 48%, keeping Harris in a strong position here in the race to 270. This poll, conducted between October 27th and 30th among 1,120 likely voters, places Michigan in the lean blue column, now turning to Wisconsin, where Marquette University has Harris leading by a point among 753, probably voters at 48% to 47%. The gold standard poll everyone searches down the stretch here in Wisconsin is Marquette for Harris. This would be simply a huge outcome. She probably has to sweep the Rust Belt if the Sun Belt states seem more and more out of grasp, giving her a chance at 270. Given that Wisconsin is wider and more rural than the other WIMP states, its demographics are the most favorable to Republicans. Given he beat final polling averages by more than 6.5 points in both 2016 and 2020, another Trump overperformance among white working-class voters could be decisive here, turning now to Minnesota, which voted for Hillary Clinton by 1.5 points, while the others backed Trump. This state deviated from the other WIMP states. In 2016, Biden stretched the Democratic margin to 7 points in 2020. Harris and her running buddy, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, are expected to prevail by a like margin now in 2024, with 728 likely voters. PED last week, Harris leads Trump by 8 points, according to the most recent poll USA conducted. Minnesota thus stays in the probably blue column for the Democrats. Now descending in the Southwest, we begin with Texas, the second biggest prize on the electoral map with 40 votes. Texas has trended left over the past 2 decades, with Trump carrying the state by just 5.5 points in 2020. But regardless of whether that margin closes even to 4 points or opens wider, Harris will almost certainly lose here, with the latest University of Texas at Austin poll showing Trump leading by 6 points with a strong preference among Latino voters. Harris struggles particularly with men and in small cities and rural areas if the Hispanic vote is not going as planned, and Trump secures a tight victory with the likes of Allen West in the governor's race. This map will confirm that Texas's 40 electoral votes stay in the Republican column. Now we arrive at Arizona, where polls once again seem to complicate matters. An expanding electorate and newfound minority potential allowed Biden to carve out a narrow margin here in 2020, taking the state for the first time since 1996. 4 years later, things appear completely different for Harris and her potential position here. even while she starts out as a slight favorite to win Harris trails. Trump by 3 points in the latest high-quality poll at 48% to 45%. Also, 11% remain undecided if Trump can limit Harris's margins among Latino voters and younger voters while holding or expanding his own advantage. He stands poised to flip Arizona back red in 2024. The state goes as lean Republican by our calculations as well. Now, as we get to the last call of the night at 10 p.m., with Nevada, we find it notable that in 2020, Biden took it for Democrats, but only by 2.4%. Yet also, as most recent polling shows, Harris is leading Trump by a solid 5 points in Nevada, 50% to 45% among 784 likely voters, PED from October 27th to 30th. The latest Nevada poll grants Harris a strong incentive to believe she can keep this state that would add 3 more to her total, reaching a total of 218, just shy of 270. The momentum Harris held through the night takes a bit of a turn at the final stop of the night as we review the impact of the now lower profile West Coast states here. I'll examine California, Oregon, and Washington, starting with California. That is certainly a safe Democrat state now secured in Harris's count before moving on to Oregon, which carries 7 electoral votes, usually considered a safe state for Democrats recently. However, the trend has been shifting to the right. Harris will only hold it by a margin of 2.8%. According to the most recent survey just released from the University of Oregon poll, with both candidates at 49%. While Harris holds a tenuous edge based on early returns, an 11% lead among minorities remains paramount. The outlook is tenuous at best as Democrats look for help from the growing Latino electorate going into 2024, but ultimately the trends have improved for Republicans, and the Democrats need to remember this state may not be as safe as they once believed. Finally, now moving on to Washington, which Harris won by 16 points 4 years ago and probably holds on to now with a solid lead over Trump in a Monmouth poll, which puts Harris at 55% while Trump sits at 39%. Harris wins Washington undoubtedly with those extra electoral votes. Now let us summarize the current picture of the electoral landscape across 51 states in 2024 with 4 different categories, now helping to organize our electoral map as we've gone along across the past several hours, and states classified as safe for either party, starting with Harris at 218. Overall, now Trump's 167 from the Republicans over the next 3 states. We recorded a total of 72 electoral votes between them. These 12 battleground states above all else will determine who can cross the 270 electoral vote threshold on our map. Harris leads in 8 states totaling 46 electoral votes, while Trump trails behind in 4 states totaling 26 votes of those 46 electoral votes. Harris has a slight margin overall against Trump, indicating a slight lead among 8 states for our final count. We're left with Harris totaling 264 electoral votes to Trump's 193, which means as it stands with the vote shifting as it did on the night, and 2 more states remaining on the night remaining, we can conclude Harris is on the cusp of claiming victory, while Trump would need to run the board in the last 2 critical states. But with both candidates ahead in just about half of the ballots, and points to some clear trends having developed, as we now turn towards the final stop of the night when the final votes are counted, we find both candidates will have potential pathways remaining open for themselves heading into the last stages of this election season. As we have identified our results holding close in many competitive states, it is still hard to predict who will ultimately top in the battle for 270. The stakes have never been higher as it continues to shift closer to Election Day. While they remained on the board, the final results for the night have established 2 key issues critical to each candidate's pathways to victory in the remaining battlegrounds. First, we now find ourselves on the edge of deciding how independent voters are turning out across the country. For the first time in over 20 years, they are positioned to hold sway over these final two states. After historically favoring the Democrats in increasingly more competitive states, the final two electoral votes could thus ultimately depend on how their final decisions swing and how it shows in the final numbers. To calculate as we see before us, Harris leading but still requiring those final votes to reach that threshold as she readies her campaign to meet the mounting pressure against Trump over the final stretch, while the next critical push can offer either candidate their paths moving forward. Ultimately, they must prioritize in these final hours in hopes of reaching that last mile in the race to 270